Hello Internet, and welcome to a very special Evitel review of Shadows Rising, the brand new Warcraft novel from extremely good and incredibly strong author Madeleine Roux. Now, first things first, I'll be talking about the book in detail. There will be spoilers, so if you're averse to that kind of thing, kindly turn off your device, stow it away, and go play some WoW or something. And if you are okay with spoilers, stay tuned, as we'll be talking about the story and lore implications of Shadows Rising. Who lives? Who dies? Who kind of but not really dies? Who dies but then doesn't die? And who just refuses to die? And who's dying of thirst? 'Cause yeah. I really enjoyed this book because beyond satiating my own thirst for Warcraft lore, of course, it got me thinking about franchise novels in general and cross-media characters and how it's a really good example of storytelling for an IP that spans multiple games, books, comics, fandoms, Funko Pops, you name it. And as much as this being a review, I'd also like it to be an exploration of sorts into what role a novel like Shadows Rising is even supposed to play in a sprawling and decades-old franchise like Warcraft. So join me as we delve into the dark and twisty and, in my opinion, very satisfying world of Shadows Rising. Okay? I'm not gonna do that bit. You know how it goes. Let's go, bookworms. Shadows Rising is the official prequel novel to the upcoming Shadowlands expansion to World of Warcraft, and as a prequel, it expectedly sets in motion a number of events leading up and into our forthcoming experience of Shadowlands. So I'm not going to walk through every single plot point in detail. Does this look like Cliff's Notes to you, babe? But in summary, here's the story in a nutshell. The book follows three main plots. 1. Still reeling in the wake of Sylvanas' departure, the Horde is now led by a new council, which is basically being held together with old gumwads and sticky tape. We see just how unsteady they are after an assassination attempt on Queen Talanji's life in Orgrimmar, who retreats to Dazara lore, only to be nearly assassinated again, which sends her breaking away from the Horde and into full recluse mode. 2. Meanwhile, the Alliance, also still kind of obsessed with Sylvanas, is piecing together evidence that Dark Rangers, and therefore maybe also Sylvie herself, have a presence in Zandalar. They send out various adventure and sometimes torture parties like Turalyon and Illyria and Flynn and Shaw to find out what they can, while Anduin stays at home in Stormwind, struggling with the weight of the world bearing down on his little boy king shoulders. And thirdly, we see what pasty henchman Nathanos and the Dark Rangers are plotting, which is basically being quite murdery and bolstering the Widow's Bite, the group of Zandalari rebels set on assassinating Talanji. Nathanos does this because he also wants to see Talanji dead, but mostly because he really wants to kill Bwonsamdi, the Loa of Graves himself. Why? Bwonsamdi is a menace and knows too much, Nathanos tells us. Once he is dead and the Dark Lady's plans are in motion, there will be no more pain. We will be free of the cruelties of this world. Ooh. More on that later. Talanji and Bwonsamdi are, of course, bound together through a pact made between the Loa and Talanji's father, Rastakhan. So, if Nathanos and company want to kill one of them, they're going to have to kill both. These three stories of the Horde, Alliance, and Sylvanas operatives intersect throughout the book. An uneasy alliance between the Alliance and the Horde, just barely held together by Thrall and Jaina, or more specifically that one time she touched his arm in a really tender way. Thrall takes a sneaky trip, along with Bane and Kalia, to see Malfurion and Tyrande to warn them of a disturbance in the spirit realm he's heard reports of, and presumably to apologize on behalf of the Horde in regards to, you know, the genociding. Tyrande is, understandably, really angry and refuses to speak until Thrall brings her the head of Sylvanas. Thrall and Jaina navigate their tenuous collaboration and shared choice intelligence to prevent an all-out war between the two factions, reassuring the Alliance that they are not, in fact, sheltering Sylvanas on Zandalar, and that they really are on the same side, for now, at least. After lots of statecraft on the Horde side, general adventuring with the Alliance, and relentless scheming by the Dark Rangers, the book culminates in the massive final battle at the Necropolis, where Nathanos and the Dark Rangers face off against Bwonsamdi, Talanji's forces, and the support she ultimately accepts from the Horde. The battle ends. The dust settles, we lick our wounds, and return to a world pretty much unchanged, because no one really dies. I mean, plenty die, including Talanji's former BFF and nemesis Apari, who was created for the book, and like, lots of trolls, but all of our major lore characters remain intact. We get a little epilogue with pretty much our only glimpse of Sylvanas, and poof, the end. When you lay it out like that, it helps you realize that while a lot happens in the book, nothing really happens. I mean, nothing happens that changes or otherwise determines the story that plays out for us in World of Warcraft. And that, my friends, is something that I think makes this book really great. Because it doesn't, God forbid, force you to read a book in order to keep up with essential story elements. Instead of going for story progression and breadth, it focuses instead on depth. Depth. Where did that come from? So with that out of the way, here are the things that worked really well in Shadows Rising. Unsurprisingly, for a prequel to a game that shows what happens when we die in Azeroth, there's a big thematic focus on death. But rather than focusing on killing, well, apart from all of those dead trolls, it navigates death, grief, and the fallout of those things from a wide range of perspectives. Everyone is grappling with death. Talanji struggles with the death of her father, longing to see him and have his guidance, while being bound to the actual Loa of Graves. Anduin is consumed by regret for the murder of humans and Forsaken in Arathi Highlands after their failed attempt at a meeting, for which he blames himself after trusting Sylvanas. He sits in Gold Sharin, yes, in disguise, yes, and watches young soldiers file in, knowing that it's likely they'll die at his command. Even G. Firepaw appears to remind us of the death and destruction wrought upon the Vale of Eternal Blossoms by Garrosh Hellscream. The raised Syrah Moon Warden, stuck in a state of undeath, wants nothing more than to kill as many living things as she can, as a kind of catharsis. And of course, the whole book is like a collective reckoning or coming to terms with Sylvanas' decision to destroy Teldrassil and everyone in it. One character has an especially interesting encounter with death, and that's Zakan, or Zappy Boy himself, sacrificing himself in order to save a few children from a flaming tar pit. Dude, Zakan dies. Or gets pretty much there. After being engulfed in flames, seriously though, is this guy getting a new model in Shadowlands? Zakan finds himself in a state of falling, almost endlessly, alongside other fallen spirits. He's pulled downwards towards an engulfing darkness, an evil too terrible to name. I mean, it literally has a name, it's the Maw. But eventually, he's pulled back up and into the land of the living by Bwan Samdi, who's taken a shine to the young troll and feels he could still be useful to him alive. So Zakan gets a glimpse of Shadowlands, where we'll soon be finding ourselves, and we learn that Bwanners has been using all of his waning strength to keep troll souls out of there. This is, of course, because Sylvanas has made some kind of pact with the jailer and has been funneling souls directly into the Maw for some time now. It's also why Sylvie and Nathanos want Bwan Samdi dead, because he's standing in the way of her plan to cram the Maw full of souls, for reasons that will no doubt become clear to us once we get into the new expansion. So, beyond the story itself and thematic content, there's a lot I love about this book in terms of structure and stylistic decisions. First of all, there's the characterization. I am shameless about this. I really love the way Madeleine Roux writes Warcraft characters. And I read some criticisms floating around on the internet about characters or dialogue feeling too cartoony or contrived, but what are Warcraft characters first and foremost, if not a bunch of pixels with comically big shoulder pads in like 5 different poses maximum? We're talking about a universe that of course includes novels and films and lots of high quality fan art, but which originates in video games. And in Chris Metzen's brain, if we're honest. Or in his library. When Jaina and her braid ruck up, I can picture them vividly. I can see the contrast between Lillian Voss's crumbling body and Kalia Menethil's glowing figure as they talk. A lot of this has to do with strong portrayals of characters in the game, and especially their voice acting. When I read Bwan Samdi's lines, I can hear them, and not because they're written in full Jamaican patois. In fact, they're specifically not written that way, apart from a few mons and das. And that's a testament to the strength of Madeleine's writing. And if you read Lorthamar and Thalyssera's thrumming back and forth in their short story that came out earlier, you'll already know that this kind of character work is something she does really, really well. So, when a character in Shadows Rising talks or acts, I feel like I'm watching their scene play out in an in-game cutscene. When a reference is made to an existing scene or cinematic in the game, like Sylvanas and Sourfang's Muk Gora, I see that cinematic playing out in my head. When Talanji looks at a young turquoise-skinned, yellow-haired troll girl, I know exactly what that character looks like because I have the character creation screen pretty much burned into my retinas. All this is interesting because that kind of hyper-specific detail is something I typically think of as bad writing. Books are good because they allow us to see and imagine things without a prescribed reality. Even an extreme extremely vivid description of someone or something will look completely different in every reader's mind. So why am I saying that a book which delivers characters and scenes with the perfect accuracy of an in-game cutscene is great, when that kind of thing should technically be bad? Well, 1, because the writing itself is really good, and 2, because it's a really good example of its form, which is franchise fiction. Franchise novels tend to go one or two ways. 1, where they use the existing universe as a backdrop for a new story, or 2, where they focus on existing characters to add development and depth. Before the Storm is a great example of a first, especially with characters like Safi and Grizik playing a major role. And Shadows Rising takes the latter route, focusing instead on filling out those character outlines with detail and insight. Franchise novels can of course also be vehicles for progressing a major storyline, but then you risk the wrath of the community for doing that outside of the core game. Warcraft's lore and story is actually so fragmented that I wouldn't actually mind having major plot points take place outside of the game at this point, but that's just a testament to how broken the game experience is. If only there was some way to fix it. Now look, I've spent a lot of time reading very serious books that I've taken very seriously. Did I mention I went to Yale? But I will always have time for a good franchise novel. Because being a good franchise writer is like being a good puppeteer or a ventriloquist, just really getting in there and bringing a character that already exists, often vividly and visually in other media, to life. And dude, puppets are awesome. When it's good, it's really good, and you get to see new life breathed into this idea of a character that only really existed in fragments of gameplay or other bits of media. When it's bad, and you get Indiana Jones fighting fanatical Nazis in the center of the earth, or inadvertently inspiring one of the biggest fiction franchises in recent memory. Whoops. At the end of the day, Shadows Rising is great puppeteering, and I love it for that. Part of what makes the characterization so fun and believable in Shadows Rising is the relationships those characters have. And you can't have a relationship without a ship. Charming buccaneer Flynn Fairwind and spymaster Matthias Shaw set sail to Zandalar in search of those pesky Dark Rangers. In typical style, they banter and they clash, much like they did in Zara lore. And then, to the surprise of probably no one and the delight of many, they kind of have a thing going on. It could be easy to write this off as complete fan service, but the development of Flynn and Shaw's attachment to each other is one of the real gems in the book. And look, it makes sense. Flynn is your typical disaster bisexual, now officially confirmed by the game designers, attracted to almost everything indiscriminately. Shaw, meanwhile, is the more secretive one, but they're both rogues who are down for a bit of poking, and their facial hair is pretty much identical, so it's pretty much destined to be. But honestly, the way their relationship sparks and kindles is a joy to read. When they're on the ship, did I mentioned they're literally on a ship? Flynn finds himself telling Shaw that his mother was a thief, and then later looks back and wonders why he felt compelled to tell the spymaster something he'd rarely told anyone else. He calls it the trove he'd always left buried. Aww. And Shaw, eventually taken hostage by the Zandalari, finds himself alone in a gilded cell, fantasizing about just sitting down and having a conversation with Flynn. Their interest in each other isn't forced. It develops slowly and naturally through just opening up to each other. What really did it for me is when Shaw notices that Flynn smells like salt, soap, and whiskey, and feels the warmth of the sun and body heat emanating from his leather jacket. And not gonna lie, I kind of fell in love with Flynn at that description too, because those are the kinds of things you notice when you fall for someone, you know? That's just how it feels. The fate of their relationship is left open, and all we know is that the two have planned for a meeting at the Gilded Rose, but we all know what's up. Speaking of so-called fan service, as you have no doubt already heard, there's a moment in the book where Bonsamdi turns to Zekan and says, "We make quite the team, little Zappy Boy." I should clarify, this is boy spelled with a Y and not an I, but still, Zappy Boy is now officially canon. Now, I had a good chuckle at seeing this cheeky nod to the community, but not everyone on the internet shared that sentiment. The most common complaints about the inclusion of Zappy Boy seem to be that it's silly, which, yeah, it is, or that it somehow diminishes the integrity of the lore. It's funny though, because throughout Zekan's ascension into memedom in the game itself, being in cinematics and as an NPC, there was no huge uproar then. It's like the instant the reference was in a book, because books are very serious, it was somehow unacceptable. And if we're talking about lore and seriousness here, please let me remind you that World of Warcraft is a palimpsest. It's made up of a huge range of influences and references and straight up theft, all layered and mixed together to become the world we recognize. From the micro level of quests and NPCs referencing pop culture, to the macro, where the whole human, orc, elf, dwarf paradigm is literally copied from Warhammer, which is itself straight out of Tolkien. And because WoW is an MMO, it's always going to belong, in part, to its players. Because we make up a good portion of the population of Azeroth, and moments like this, when the game does a little nod to its player base, it's less the knowing wink of fan service, and more an acknowledgement that actually the life and imagination that the players and community bring to the franchise, through their art, interactions, and creativity, are every bit as important and world-building as the game or books or other more official channels. The occasional little callback to its community just enriches the experience, in my opinion. Because when it comes down to it, the line between franchise fiction and fan fiction is really quite thin. On the one hand, you have sometimes really talented writers and artists and other creators expanding upon existing characters and giving them lives beyond what's established for them. And on the other hand, you have sometimes really talented writers doing the exact same thing, just with an official seal of approval, and in most cases an entire team of editors and fact-checkers and all that stuff. And what's really brilliant is that in this hyper-connected day and age, you often find those writers and creators of a source material interacting with the community they're creating for, seeing the stuff that they've made, and sometimes even, dare I say it, memeing together. And that's a strength, especially for extra content created around a video game, in which, let's be honest, I spent half of my time making sure my shoes and hat match properly, and the other half making inappropriate puns and voice chat with 20 other nerds I consider my friends, while we try to bring down a giant baddie who will hopefully drop a pair of shoes that will make me extremely powerful, but that will also hopefully match my hat. Which is why when I see "this reads like fan fiction" on a 1-star Amazon review, my response is, yeah, like good fan fiction. Like a piece of writing that does the puppeteering thing really well and gives me a little more time with characters I enjoy. Another criticism that's been levied against the book, and which plenty of fan fiction gets as well, is that nothing really happens. Or rather, nothing important happens, as in we're not receiving pivotal plot points that advance some kind of relentless uber narrative. But that's also not what makes a good book, to be quite honest with you. For the record, I am not trying to say that all fanfiction is categorically good, because it's definitely not. There is plenty of bad fanfiction out there, it totally exists. It's called 50 Shades of Grey. And look, to come back to the whole Zappy Boy thing, at the end of the day, it's Somdi who says it. This is the guy who relentlessly shits on you when you die in Zandalar. If anyone is going to throw an offhand remark about a little troll shaman doing a zappy thing, it's gonna be him. Shadows Rising also explores some interesting dualities, which shouldn't come as a huge surprise from a game that revolves around the endless struggle of blue versus red. And if you know anything about the Warcraft cosmology, you'll know that it's built on opposing and balancing forces, so there's a lot of that in the book as well. There's of course the push and pull between life and death, which is pretty much everywhere. But particularly interestingly in the story of Nathanos and his very similar looking cousin Stefan, where Sylvanas basically sacrifices Stefan's living body to plump up and reanimate Nathanos' desiccated one. There's the rebel leader Apari, who's described as at once strikingly beautiful with glistening silver hair, but whose body is literally rotting with infection, or you could say her own hatred. And then of course there's the dueling light and shadow of Turalyon and Illyria, forces so opposed that they can't even touch. Or can they? Because look, Turalyon and Illyria actually touch at one point in the story when he puts his big shiny mitt on her shoulder and she finds it soothing. I thought it was pretty much impossible given her big void energy and his being light forged and all, but I don't know. They've clearly found a way to navigate that difference, as evidenced by the way they employ their dual powers to coax information about the Dark Rangers from a human witness, namely through torture, in which Turalyon holds him down with golden shackles of light, while Illyria penetrates his mind with the void. Sorry, where was I? Oh, and speaking of void, there's a very interesting moment towards the end when Anduin, confronting the captured Syrah, sees a flash of dark purple energy running down his arm, frightening everyone in the room, especially Jaina. And then Syrah says, "How does it feel to know you have lost? Take heart, Falling Lion. you will serve well. Ooh. Don't forget, the boy king serves at the master's table. 3 lies will he offer thee. And I think the novel being full of such dualities is interesting as a concept anyway, because of course the existence of this book is something of a duality itself. It's a creative work, but also a license. It's a satisfying and at times exciting story, but also fills in the gap between the real story of the games. It vividly describes characters and locations, but often using reference points that it knows the reader already understands and recognizes. The writer of a franchise novel has a foot in both worlds. They're furthering an official arc and direction dictated to them by, well, Steve Denuser, but within those restrictions, they're carving out their own little corner of the world to explore and be creative, just like us, the players, do. And finally, in things that are great about Shadows Rising, the book is what I guess I'd call true to the experience of the game, or even just playing a video game in general. I mean, the book opens with a little vignette in Westfall, which is appropriate as it's pretty much a starting zone. It may as well have opened in Northshire Abbey with Marshall McBride saying, "Hey there," and then inviting you, the level 1 reader, on an exciting journey through the lives of major players in Azeroth. There are callbacks to other cutscenes and cinematics you're familiar with, like Jaina and Thrall's meeting, where they say, "What's different this time? We are," you know, the arm-touchy one. But there are also other examples that are very specific to the game, like how really extremely annoying it is for anyone to get around Dazara lore. Like, there are pages of Thrall and G literally just climbing stairs. Like, I physically reached for my Hearthstone cushion as I was reading those bits. The frustration of getting around the Pinkamid was so real. And then the book ends with an actual cinematic. The epilogue I mentioned before opens with Sylvanas destroying the Helm of Domination at the foot of Icecrown Citadel, with the book literally pulling quotes from the cinematic. You know, that power will be your prison, this world is a prison, and I will set us all free. You can see it all replaying in your mind as you read it. However, just to shake things up and remind us that we are reading a book and not just a transcript of a cinematic, Nathanos suddenly appears at Sylvanas' side, using her spooky smoke magic, bearing the bad news of his failure to destroy Buoners. Sylvanas remembers Sourfang's taunt at their Mak'gara, "You just keep failing," a reference to yet another cinematic, and you can pretty much hear that line exactly how it was said. Sylvie then sends her lapdog home to Maris Stead, lets us know she's in cahoots with the jailer, tells us she had been the plaything of a self-righteous cosmos long enough, and steps into the darkness of the Shadowlands. And that's how the book ends, and that is where the expansion begins. So even structurally, we've gone on a journey from the cozy starting zone vibes of Westfall to the moment Sylvanas steps into the Shadowlands, into the unknown of a new expansion. There's a really nice moment when Jaina looks at a map of Azeroth and Stormwind Keep, and she thinks to herself how well a map represented lands, but how poorly it described the little tiny things that truly made up a whole entire world. And reading that, I couldn't help but think about Shadows Rising as a whole, how well it worked, and how vividly and wonderfully it described those little tiny things that truly make up a whole entire world. Thank you for joining me on this probably very long-winded journey through Shadows Rising. It has been honestly a real treat for me to do. If you liked the video, don't thank me. Thank our patrons who give their actual real-life money to support the channel. Without them, I literally wouldn't have made this video. So thanks, guys. If you didn't like it, downvote the shit out of it. And remember, my name is Taliesin. I've been waiting so long to do that. No, my name is Evitel, from me, and Taliesin, and an Iron. Cheerio. Bye!